The seventh bride ran. The wagon wheels cut through fresh snow while Elias Crow stood frozen in the doorway, watching another woman choose death over him. 7 times he'd prepared this cabin. 7 times he'd been abandoned. In these mountains, winter killed slower than loneliness, and he was dying of both. Stay with me through this story. If it reaches your corner of the world, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. Hit that like button, and let's begin. The silence after the wagon left was always the worst part. Elias didn't move from the doorway. His hand gripped the frame hard enough that splinters bit into his palm, but he barely felt it. The cold air burned his lungs with each breath, sharp and clean and completely indifferent to whether he lived or died. The wagon, already just a dark smudge against the white expanse, carried the 7th woman who'd taken one look at what her life would be and chosen to risk the journey back instead. He'd stopped learning their names after the 3rd one. The mountains didn't care about names either. They rose around his cabin like the walls of a prison carved from stone and ice, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Most men looked at these peaks and saw majesty. Elias had lived here long enough to see them for what they really were, a test that never ended, a challenge that ground you down one frozen day at a time until there was nothing left but survival. He'd been surviving for 6 years. The door hung open behind him, spilling warmth into the November air. Wasteful. Everything in winter was measured in resources, in calculations of what you could afford to lose. Heat, food, hope. He'd burned through his supply of the last one somewhere around bride number 4, but he kept going through the motions anyway. What else was there to do? Elias finally moved, stepping back inside and shutting the door with more force than necessary. The cabin swallowed him, one room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and workshop all at once, with a loft above for storage and a root cellar below for supplies. 16 feet by 20. He'd built every inch of it himself, cutting the logs, notching them, chinked the gaps with moss and mud. It had taken him 8 months of brutal work, and when he'd finished, he'd stood back and felt something close to pride. That was before he understood what it meant to live here alone. The silence pressed in from all sides. He could hear the wind starting to pick up outside, that low moan that meant another storm was building. Could be hours away, could be minutes. November weather in these mountains didn't follow predictions. It did whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted, and you either prepared for everything or you died. He'd prepared. The woodpile was stacked 10 feet high against the north wall of the cabin, each log split and dried and ready. The root cellar held enough preserved food to last through April if he was careful. The windows were small and thick, designed to hold heat rather than let in light. He had traps set for small game, fishing line ready for when the creek froze, and a rifle with ammunition he couldn't afford to waste. Everything a man needed to survive winter alone. Everything except a reason to want to. Elias moved to the stove and fed it another log, watching the flames catch and spread. The heat felt good against his face, but it didn't reach the cold that had settled somewhere deeper, in his chest, in his bones. He was 32 years old. He'd come to these mountains at 26, running from a war that had taken pieces of him he'd never get back, looking for a place where the quiet might feel like peace instead of punishment. He'd found the quiet. The peace never showed up. The letter from the matchmaking service sat on the table where he'd left it that morning. Miss Eleanor Hartford, 24, from Pennsylvania. Good with cooking and mending. Seeking a fresh start in the West. He'd read it 3 times before she arrived, trying to imagine what kind of woman would answer an advertisement for a wife in the mountains. What kind of desperation or hope or madness it took to agree to marry a stranger in the middle of nowhere. He'd imagined wrong. They all had their reasons. He'd learned that much. But none of those reasons were ever strong enough to outlast their first real look at what they'd signed up for. The isolation, the cold, the work that never ended. Him, especially him. Elias caught his reflection in the window glass, dark against the white world outside. Tall, but bent like something that had grown in the wrong direction. Shoulders that had been broad once, before hunger and loneliness had worn him down. Hair too long, beard unkempt, eyes that had forgotten how to look at anything but the next task, the next threat, the next day to survive. He looked like exactly what he was. A man who'd stopped believing there was anything beyond survival. The 7th bride had taken one look and known she didn't want to become that too. He couldn't blame her. Hell, he'd warned them all in his letters, been as honest as the matchmaking service would allow. Life here is hard. Winter lasts 8 months. The nearest town is a 2-day ride when the weather's good, impossible when it's not. I'm not looking for romance or comfort. I need a partner who can work, who can endure, who won't break when things get difficult. What he hadn't written, what he couldn't figure out how to put into words, was the part that mattered most. I'm so tired of being alone that some mornings I can't remember why I bother getting out of bed. I need someone to see me as something more than a half-wild stranger who chose the worst possible place to wait out the rest of his life. I need proof that I'm still human. But you couldn't put that in a letter to a woman you'd never met. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. The storm was coming faster than he'd thought. Elias moved through the cabin in the pattern he'd established over 6 winters, checking the door seal, making sure the shutters were latched, filling the water barrel from the pump before it froze. Muscle memory. Survival stripped down to its most basic components. He was halfway through checking the chimney damper when he heard it. The distant sound of wagon wheels, faint under the rising wind. His hands went still. No, that wasn't possible. The 7th bride's wagon had left hours ago. There was no reason for anyone else to be on the mountain road, especially not with a storm building. The supply wagon wasn't due for another month. No one came up here in November. No one was that stupid. But the sound grew louder, unmistakable now. Wheels on frozen ground, a horse's labored breathing. Elias moved to the window and wiped the frost away, peering into the gray afternoon light. A wagon, coming up the mountain toward his cabin. He felt something twist in his chest. Not hope, he'd given that up, but something adjacent to it. Confusion, maybe. Or dread. He'd sent word to the matchmaking service 3 days ago, after the 7th bride left, telling them he was done. No more. He couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't keep watching women realize they'd made a terrible mistake. Couldn't keep feeling like he was the mistake they'd made. But services like that worked on delays and crossed letters and bureaucratic indifference. Somewhere in an office in Denver, someone had probably already sent the next name, drawn up the next contract, put another woman on a train heading west without knowing that Elias Crow had finally given up. The wagon rolled into the clearing in front of his cabin and stopped. Elias didn't move. He stood at the window, watching, waiting to see what kind of disaster was about to unfold this time. The driver, same man who brought all the brides, a weather-beaten old-timer named Dutch, who made the mountain run for extra money, climbed down slowly, his movements stiff with cold. He walked around to the back of the wagon and extended his hand to help someone down. A woman emerged, wrapped in so many layers of wool and fur that Elias couldn't make out much beyond her general shape. She moved carefully, taking Dutch's hand but not leaning on him, finding her footing on the icy ground, with the kind of caution that came from experience rather than fear. Dutch was already unloading her trunk, a single piece of luggage, small and practical. That was different. Most of the brides had shown up with multiple trunks full of things that made no sense in the mountains, items they'd insisted on bringing from their old lives, as if enough familiar objects could make this place feel less foreign. Elias watched Dutch gesture toward the cabin, saw the woman nod. She didn't look around the way the others had, that wide-eyed scanning of the landscape, the visible moment when they realized just how isolated they were about to be. She just stood there, her face turned toward the cabin, waiting. He should go out there, should at least pretend to be the kind of man who welcomed people properly, who didn't make women stand in the cold while he tried to figure out what the hell to say. But his feet wouldn't move. He'd done this 7 times already. He'd stood on his porch and watched 7 different women take in the reality of what they'd agreed to, watch the hope or resignation or determination in their faces transform into something else. Usually panic, sometimes disgust, occasionally a kind of grim acceptance that never lasted more than a few days. He was so tired of watching that transformation. Dutch knocked on the door hard enough to rattle it in the frame. "Crow, you in there?" Elias closed his eyes, took a breath that felt like swallowing glass, and opened the door. The wind hit him immediately, colder than it had been even an hour ago. Dutch stood on his porch looking annoyed, which was his default expression, but there was something else underneath it. Pity, maybe, or frustration. Hard to tell with Dutch. "Got a delivery for you," Dutch said, jerking his thumb toward the woman who still stood by the wagon. "Miss Marisol Vega. Train got her into Denver 2 weeks ago. Stage brought her as far as the trading post, and I brought her the rest of the way. She's paid up, paperwork's in order, and she knows what she's getting into, or says she does." Elias looked past Dutch to the woman. She'd pulled the scarf down from her face now, and he could see her features in the gray light, dark eyes, dark hair pulled back tight, skin that had seen sun and wind and hadn't been softened by either. She was looking right at him, not staring but not looking away either, just looking, taking his measure the same way he was taking hers. "There's been a mistake," Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. "I sent word 3 days ago. I can't do this anymore." "Well, your word got to Denver the same day Miss Vega here got on the train," Dutch said. "So unless you want to pay me double to take her back down the mountain right now, in this weather, she's yours for the winter, whether you like it or not." Or, the wind gusted hard enough to make the wagon sway. Dutch glanced at the sky, and Elias saw him calculating the same thing Elias was calculating. The storm was going to hit before dark. Maybe before the hour was out. Getting down the mountain in that kind of weather was suicide. "I'll come back in the spring," Dutch said, making the decision for both of them. "You two figure it out or don't, that's your business. But she stays here till the pass clears." He was already moving toward the wagon, ready to turn it around and get as far down the mountain as he could, before the storm made even that impossible. Elias felt something like anger rise in his throat. "You can't just leave her here." "Can and am." Dutch was up in the driver's seat now, gathering the reins. "You got a contract, Crow. She's here legal. What you do about it is on you." He snapped the reins, and the horse lurched forward, clearly as eager to get off this mountain as Dutch was. Elias watched the wagon go, the same way he'd watched 7 others leave. Except this time, the woman they'd brought wasn't in it. He turned to look at her. She was still standing there, one hand resting on top of her trunk, watching him with those dark, unreadable eyes. The wind whipped around her, pulling at her coat, but she didn't move. Didn't chase after the wagon like some of the others had. Didn't burst into tears or start demanding explanations. She just stood there. "You going to invite me in?" she said finally, her voice carrying clear over the wind. "Or are we both going to freeze out here making a point?" Her accent was different, something he couldn't quite place, vowels rounded in ways that didn't match the harsh consonants of the mountain towns. There was no tremor in her voice, no question underneath the question, just a statement of fact. Standing out here was stupid, and they both knew it. Elias stepped back from the door, not quite a welcome, but close enough. Marisol, Miss Vega, he should call her Miss Vega until they figured out what this was, picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing and walked toward the cabin. She climbed the 3 steps to his porch without hesitation, carried the trunk inside, and set it down against the wall with a solid thunk that suggested it was mostly books or tools, not the fancy dresses and useless things most of the others had brought. She turned to face him, pulling off her gloves with efficient movements. "You're Elias Crow." Not a question. He nodded anyway. "I'm Marisol Vega. I know you tried to cancel. Dutch told me on the way up. I came anyway." She unwrapped the scarf from around her neck, folded it with sharp, precise movements, and set it on the trunk. "I'm not here because I thought this would be easy, and I'm not leaving because you look at me like I'm a problem you didn't ask for. We have a contract. The mountains don't care about your second thoughts, and neither do I." Elias stared at her. Every other bride had started with some version of the same script: nervous introductions, attempts at small talk, forced politeness, while they both pretended this wasn't the strangest, most uncomfortable situation imaginable. Marisol had just walked in and stated facts like she was reporting the weather. "You don't know what you're agreeing to," he said. "I know it's November, I know we're about to get hit by a storm, I know the nearest town is 2 days away in good weather and impossible in bad." She started unbuttoning her coat, revealing layers of wool underneath, practical and worn. "I know you've had 7 brides before me, and they all left. I know you're standing there trying to figure out how to tell me to leave too, but I'm not going anywhere until spring at the earliest. How do you eat? Dutch talks. So do the women in the trading post. I've been there for 4 days waiting for the weather to clear enough for the trip up here. I heard stories." She folded her coat and added it to the pile on her trunk. "You want to know what I learned? You're a man who came here to die slowly, and you keep writing to matchmaking services because some part of you hasn't given up yet. That's the part I'm betting on." The words hit like fists. Elias felt his jaw tighten, felt anger and something worse, shame, maybe, rise up in his chest. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're still breathing. Marisol looked around the cabin, her gaze sharp and assessing. She walked to the stove, held her hands out to the heat. I know you kept this place warm even after the last woman left. I know you have enough wood stacked outside to last the winter. Enough food in that root cellar I can smell from here to make it through to spring. You're surviving. That's more than most people can say. Surviving isn't living. No, she agreed. But it's a start. Outside, the wind picked up hard enough to make the whole cabin shudder. The storm was here. Elias moved on instinct, crossing to the windows and latching the inside shutters, sealing them into the cabin with lamplight and firelight and the sound of their own breathing. When he turned back, Marisol was at the table, unpacking items from a smaller bag he hadn't noticed before. A tin of coffee, a cloth bundle that smelled like bread, a small jar of something that might have been jam or preserves. What are you doing? Making myself useful. She glanced at him. You eaten today? He hadn't. He'd been too busy preparing for the seventh bride's departure, then too numb after watching her leave to think about food. Marisol seemed to take his silence as answer enough. She moved around the cabin like she'd been there before, finding the coffee pot, locating the pump for water, assessing what he had in the way of supplies. You got flour? Bacon? Both in the root cellar. I know. She was already lifting the trapdoor, climbing down the ladder with the same careful confidence she'd shown stepping off the wagon. Elias heard her moving around below, heard the scrape of a barrel lid, the rustle of cloth bags. She emerged a minute later with flour, a slab of bacon, and a jar of beans that had been soaking. How did you— Oh, I looked. She set everything on the table and started working, her movements economical and practiced. You're going to stand there watching me all night, or are you going to do something useful? Elias realized he was still standing by the shutters like an idiot. What do you need? Nothing, but that stack of firewood by the door could use sorting, green wood to the left, seasoned to the right. Keeps the smoke down if you're careful about what you burn. She was right. He'd been mixing them, too tired to care about efficiency, and the cabin had been smokier than it needed to be. Elias moved to the woodpile and started sorting, his hands remembering the weight and feel of each log. The way seasoned wood felt lighter, sounded different when you knocked two pieces together. The cabin filled with the smell of coffee, then bacon, then bread, frying in the bacon grease. His stomach woke up hard enough to hurt. How long had it been since he'd eaten a real meal? Since someone had cooked for him? Since there had been any sound in this place besides wind and his own breathing? Marisol worked without talking, which Elias appreciated more than he could say. The other brides had tried to fill the silence with chatter, nervous observations about the cabin, questions about his life, stories about theirs. It always felt false, like they were both reading lines from a script neither of them believed in. Marisol just cooked, her focus entirely on the task, and the silence felt clean instead of empty. When she finally set a plate in front of him, bacon, beans, fried bread, coffee so strong it looked like it could dissolve the cup, he stared at it for a moment too long. It's food, she said, sitting down across from him with her own plate. Not poison. Eat. He ate. The first bite tasted like something he'd forgotten existed, not just sustenance, but actual flavor, care put into the preparation. The bread was crispy on the edges, soft in the middle. The beans had been seasoned with something he didn't recognize but liked. Even the coffee was better than anything he'd managed to make himself in 6 years. Where did you learn to cook like this? My mother. Marisol didn't elaborate, just kept eating with the same focused efficiency she'd shown in the preparation. You're out of salt. The beans need more. And your coffee's been sitting in that tin so long it's gone bitter. That's why you've been making it so weak. Fresh beans would help. Supply wagon won't come till December. Then we make do. She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something that might have been amusement in her eyes. I've made do with worse. The storm hit full force while they were finishing the meal. Wind screamed around the cabin, driving snow against the shutters hard enough to sound like thrown gravel. The temperature dropped so fast Elias could feel it even through the walls, even with the stove burning hot. Marisol helped him clear the table without being asked, worked beside him to wash the dishes in water heated on the stove, then turned to survey the cabin with the same assessing look she'd given everything else. You sleep up there? She nodded toward the loft. No, that's storage. I use the bed here. He gestured to the corner where his narrow cot sat, barely wide enough for one person. Not anymore. Marisol grabbed a blanket from her trunk, along with what looked like a rolled-up sleeping mat. I'll take the loft. You keep the bed. You can't? Heat rises. Loft will be warmer. And I'm not sharing a bed with a stranger, contract or no contract. She met his eyes, and there was steel underneath the calm. We clear on that? They were clear. Relief and something like respect washed through him in equal measure. You need help getting your things up there? I can manage. She was already climbing the ladder, the blanket and mat rolled under one arm. Elias watched her disappear into the loft, heard her moving around overhead, arranging her space with the same efficient purpose she'd brought to everything else. He stood alone in his main room, listening to the storm rage outside and the sound of someone else living in his space, and felt something shift inside him. Not hope. He still wouldn't call it that. But maybe the absence of hopelessness. Maybe the first crack in the ice that had formed around his chest 6 years ago. Marisol's head appeared over the edge of the loft. Crow. Elias, he said. If we're living in the same house, you can call me Elias. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Elias, the shutter's on the north window, the latch is loose. Storm like this, they'll break. You should fix it before we sleep. She was right. He should have noticed it himself, but he'd stopped caring about the small details, the things that only mattered if you planned on surviving past tomorrow. He grabbed his tools and went to work on the latch while Marisol settled in above him, the cabin filling with small sounds that weren't his own. The rustle of blankets, the creak of floorboards, breathing that wasn't just an echo of his breathing. The storm howled outside. Inside, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias Crow didn't feel alone. He didn't trust it, didn't believe it would last. But for tonight, for this moment, it was enough to keep working on the latch, to make sure the cabin held against the wind, to know that when morning came, there would be another person there to see it. That was more than he'd had yesterday. That was more than he'd let himself want in years. The latch fixed, he banked the fire and lay down on his cot, listening to the storm and the sound of Marisol breathing in the loft above him. Sleep came easier than it had in months, pulled him down into darkness that felt less like drowning and more like simple, earned rest. His last thought before sleep took him completely was this. Maybe the 7th bride running had been the best thing that could have happened. Maybe the 8th one staying was the thing that would save him. Or destroy them both. The mountain didn't care which. But for the first time in 6 years, Elias Crow was willing to find out. Morning came with a silence so complete that Elias woke thinking he'd gone deaf. No wind, no creak of timber, just the absence of sound that meant the storm had passed and left the world buried under fresh snow. He lay still for a moment, disoriented by the light filtering through the gaps in the shutters. Too bright, too clean. Then he heard it. Footsteps overhead. Marisol was already awake, moving around in the loft with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown the night before. He sat up, his back protesting. The cabin was cold enough that his breath came out in clouds, but the stove still held a few coals from the night before. He fed it kindling, coaxing the fire back to life, trying to remember the last time he'd woken up and had to move quietly because someone else was in the house. You always get up this early? Marisol's voice came from above, followed by her boots appearing on the ladder. Haven't overslept in 6 years. Elias glanced at her as she climbed down. Her hair was already braided tight, her clothes practical, wool trousers like a man would wear, a thick sweater that had been mended more than once. Storms passed. I noticed. She walked to the nearest window and unlatched the shutter, pushing it open. White light flooded the cabin, so bright it hurt to look at. The world outside had been transformed. Everything buried under at least 3 feet of new snow, the landscape smoothed into gentle curves that hid all the familiar landmarks. Beautiful, if you didn't know how deadly it was. Marisol stared out at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she closed the shutter most of the way, leaving just enough gap to let in light. We'll need to clear a path to the woodpile, and check the roof. That much snow, there's probably weight stress on the beams. Elias blinked. You know about roof stress? I know about snow. She moved to the stove, checking the fire he'd started. I grew up in the mountains, different mountains than these, but snow works the same everywhere. Heavy, wet, and waiting to kill you if you're not careful. Where? He was pulling on his boots, trying to remember if she'd mentioned it in any of the letters. But there hadn't been any letters from her, just the one from the service telling him her name and when she'd arrive. New Mexico territory, near Taos. She was already measuring out coffee, her movements automatic. Small village, mostly families who'd been there longer than anyone could remember. We left when I was 16. The way she said "we left" carried weight. Elias didn't push. He finished lacing his boots and grabbed his heavy coat from the peg by the door. "I'll check the roof. You shouldn't go out there until I've cleared. I'm coming with you." She was pulling on her own coat, wrapping the scarf around her face. "You go through that drift alone and break your leg. I can't carry you back. 2 sets of eyes, 2 sets of hands. That's how you survive this." She was right, and they both knew it. Elias grabbed the spare shovel from the corner. He'd always kept 2, though he'd never had anyone to use the second one, and handed it to her. Their eyes met for a moment, and he saw something there that made him think she understood exactly what that gesture meant, that he was trusting her, that he was accepting her help, that he was letting her stay. They worked in silence, clearing a narrow path from the cabin door to the woodpile. The snow was heavy and wet, exactly like Marisol had said, and by the time they'd cut through to the stacked logs, Elias was sweating under his coat despite the cold. Marisol worked beside him, her shovel biting into the snow with steady, practiced strokes. She didn't complain, didn't slow down, didn't do anything except work. The sun climbed higher, turning the white world around them into something that hurt to look at even through squinted eyes. Elias checked the roof from the ground first, looking for sags or stress points, then climbed up with the roof rake and started pulling snow down in controlled slides. Marisol worked below, clearing the fallen snow away from the cabin walls so it wouldn't melt against the wood and rot the foundation. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say that the work didn't already communicate. By noon, the path was clear, the roof was safe, and they were both exhausted in the way that only physical labor in extreme cold could make you feel. Muscles burning, lungs raw, hands aching even through thick gloves. Inside, Marisol made coffee and heated up leftover beans while Elias checked the water barrel and the chimney draw. They ate standing up, too tired to care about sitting, and the food tasted better than it had any right to because they'd earned it. "Tomorrow we need to check the traps," Elias said, breaking the silence. "Storm like that, they'll be buried. Might have caught something, might not. Either way, they need to be reset." Marisol nodded, sipping her coffee. "What else?" "What else what? What else needs doing? I'm not here to sit by the fire and look decorative." Her tone was dry, almost amused. "Give me the list." Elias set down his cup and actually thought about it. There was always work. Winter was an endless cycle of tasks that kept you alive if you did them right and killed you if you didn't. But he'd been doing all of it alone for so long that he'd stopped thinking of it as a list and started thinking of it as just the shape his days took. Firewood needs to be brought in daily. Can't let the pile inside get low. If we get another storm like last night, we might not be able to get outside for days. He ticked items off on his fingers without really meaning to. Water barrels need to be filled before they freeze. There's a creek about 100 yards north, but it's probably iced over now. We'll need to chip through to get to it. The root cellar needs checking every few days, making sure nothing's frozen, nothing's rotting, inventory staying where it should be. What about fresh meat? Traps, like I said, and I've got fishing line for when the creek freezes solid enough to cut holes in it. We won't starve, but we won't have variety either. Marisol was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes fixed on something outside the window. Then she said, "I can shoot." "What?" "I can shoot. You've got a rifle. If there's game in these mountains, I can help bring it down." She looked at him directly, challenging him to argue. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I can do." Elias felt something shift in his chest. Not quite trust, but close to it. "You've hunted before?" "Since I was 12. Deer, elk, once a bear that was getting into our livestock. I'm a better shot than most men I've met, and I don't waste ammunition." She drained her coffee cup. "So, we check the traps tomorrow. Anything else?" He told her the rest. The daily routines, the weekly checks, the monthly inventory. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, asking questions that showed she was thinking about efficiency and redundancy and what happened if one of them got sick or hurt. It felt like talking to a partner instead of a stranger. It felt like planning a future that extended past the next 24 hours. It felt dangerous. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Wake before dawn, feed the fire, melt snow for water, check the weather, divide the work. They moved around each other in the small cabin like dancers learning a new routine. Awkward at first, then less so, finding the rhythm that let two people exist in a space meant for one without constantly colliding. Marisol proved herself over and over in small ways that added up to something bigger. She could repair almost anything. A broken harness, a cracked bowl, the handle on the water pump that Elias had been meaning to fix for months. She could cook meals from almost nothing that tasted like they'd taken hours of preparation. She could read the weather by the quality of light through the shutters, predict storms before the wind even changed. And she could shoot. The first time Elias took her out to check the northern trap line, he brought the rifle more out of habit than necessity. There hadn't been anything larger than a rabbit in those traps for weeks. But halfway back to the cabin, they spotted a deer, young buck, maybe 100 yards out, picking through the snow looking for frozen grass. Marisol had the rifle in her hands before Elias could reach for it. She dropped to one knee, sighted, adjusted for wind he couldn't even feel yet, and fired. The buck dropped clean, dead before it knew what had happened. Elias stared at her. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "I told you. I've been hunting since I was 12. She was already moving toward the deer, checking to make sure the kill was clean. "My father taught me. Said if I was going to eat meat, I needed to know how to get it myself." They field-dressed the deer together, working in the practiced silence of people who'd both done this before. The work was cold and bloody and necessary, and Marisol never flinched. She knew which cuts to make, how to preserve the hide, what parts to save, and what to leave for the scavengers. By the time they dragged the carcass back to the cabin, Elias had stopped thinking of her as the eighth bride and started thinking of her as Marisol, someone who existed independent of his expectations or his past failures. That night, they ate venison steaks cooked in the last of the bacon grease, and the cabin felt warmer than it had in years. "Tell me about the others," Marisol said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Elias looked up from his plate. "What?" "The other brides. The ones who left." She wasn't looking at him, just cutting her meat with careful precision. "I heard stories in the trading post, but I want to know the truth. What happened?" He should have expected this question, should have had an answer prepared. But the truth was complicated and humiliating in equal measure, and he'd spent 6 years trying not to think about it too hard. "They couldn't handle it," he said finally. "The isolation, the work, the cold. Take your pick." "That's not an answer." Marisol set down her knife and looked at him directly. "What really happened?" Elias pushed food around his plate, buying time he didn't need. The memories were clear enough, too clear. "The first one, Sarah. She lasted 2 weeks. Cried every night, barely ate, kept asking when we could go back to civilization. I put her on Dutch's wagon and sent her home." "And the second?" "Margaret. Made it a month. Decent woman, but she kept trying to make this place into something it's not. Wanted curtains and rugs and a garden come spring. Got angry when I told her none of that mattered if we didn't survive winter first." He paused. "She left on her own. Walked down the mountain in the middle of a snowstorm. I found her 3 miles out, nearly frozen to death. Carried her back, kept her alive until Dutch could come get her." Marisol's expression didn't change. "The others?" He told her. Anna, who'd been terrified of the dark and couldn't sleep without lamplight burning all night, wasting oil they couldn't spare. Rebecca, who'd expected romance and courtship and had been horrified to discover that survival didn't leave room for either. Catherine, who'd been fine until she realized the nearest doctor was 2 days away and had panicked at every bruise and scratch. Jane, who'd simply looked at him one morning and said, "I can't do this," and had been on Dutch's wagon by afternoon. "And the seventh?" Marisol asked. "Eleanor. She was different. Lasted almost 3 months, worked hard, didn't complain, seemed like she was actually settling in." Elias felt his jaw tighten. "Then one morning she told me she'd made a mistake, that she'd thought she could learn to love this place, love this life, maybe even love me. But she couldn't. She was dying inside, piece by piece, and if she stayed any longer, there'd be nothing left of her to save." The silence that followed was heavy. Elias stared at his plate, at the food he was no longer hungry for, and waited for Marisol to say something. To tell him he should have tried harder, should have been different, should have been the kind of man worth staying for. Instead, she said, "She was honest." That took courage. He looked up, surprised. "Most people lie," Marisol continued. to themselves, to others. They stay in situations that kill them slowly because leaving feels worse than dying. She knew herself well enough to leave. That's not weakness. That's survival. It felt like failure. I'm sure it did. Marisol picked up her knife and fork again, went back to eating like they'd been discussing the weather. But her failure wasn't your fault. She couldn't survive here. That's not a judgment on you, it's just fact. Elias wanted to argue, to push back, but the words wouldn't come. Because maybe she was right. Maybe he'd been carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry, blaming himself for the fact that 7 different women had looked at his life and chosen literally anything else. "Why did you come here, Sat?" he asked. "You knew about the others. You could have said no, stayed in Denver, found someone else. Why risk it?" Marisol was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she set down her utensils and folded her hands on the table, her expression distant. "I told you I left my village when I was 16. What I didn't tell you was why." She took a breath. "There was a man, older than me, from a good family. My parents approved. I thought I loved him. We were married 3 months after my 16th birthday." Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What happened?" "He died. Fever took him the first winter. We'd been married 4 months. Her voice was flat, factual. "I was pregnant. Lost the baby 2 weeks after I buried him. The village blamed me. Bad luck, bad blood, something wrong with me. My parents tried to defend me, but the damage was done. We left because staying meant I'd never be anything except the girl who brought death to a good man's house." The cabin felt too small suddenly, the air too thin. Elias didn't know what to say. What words could possibly fit the shape of that kind of loss? "We went to Santa Fe," Marisol continued. "My father found work. My mother got sick 3 years later. I took care of her until she died. My father followed 6 months after that. I think he just didn't want to be alive without her." She looked at Elias directly. "I've been alone for 5 years, working whatever jobs I could find, sleeping wherever I could afford, saving money for something I couldn't name. Then I saw the advertisement, Mountain Bride wanted, hard life, no promises, partnership only. And I thought, that's honest, that's real. I can work with real. But you came here to run away," Elias said, understanding dawning. "No." Her tone was sharp. "I came here to run toward. There's a difference. Running away is what your other brides did. Running toward is choosing something hard because the alternative is dying slowly somewhere comfortable." She stood up, started clearing the table. "I'm not here because I think you'll save me. I'm here because I'm tired of being alone, and you need someone who won't leave when things get difficult. That's not romance, that's practical." Elias watched her work, his mind churning. Everything she'd said made sense in a way that nothing else had for years. This wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't even a traditional marriage. It was 2 people who'd both been hollowed out by loss, standing in the same room and deciding that maybe being hollow together was better than being hollow alone. "Practical," he repeated. "Practical," she confirmed. She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Unless you're looking for something else?" Was he? Elias tried to examine his own motivations and came up empty. He'd written to the matchmaking service because being alone was killing him, because he needed help surviving, because some stupid part of him still believed that another person might make this life bearable. But love? Romance? He'd stopped believing in those things around bride number 3. "No," he said finally. "Practical works." Something that might have been relief crossed Marisol's face. "Good. Then we understand each other." They did. Or at least they understood enough to keep going. And for now, that was sufficient. The weeks blurred together after that conversation. December came with more snow and temperatures cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. They fell into routines that felt less like negotiation and more like second nature. Marisol handled the cooking and indoor repairs. Elias managed the heavy outdoor work and hunting. They traded off checking traps, hauling water, keeping the fire fed. They learned each other's rhythms, stopped apologizing when they bumped into each other in the cramped space, developed a shorthand that made communication efficient. Elias caught himself relaxing in ways he didn't know he'd been tense. He stopped listening for the sound of Marisol packing her trunk. Stopped bracing himself for the moment when she'd tell him she'd made a mistake. She worked too hard for that, invested too much in making the cabin functional and comfortable. She'd insulated the loft with extra blankets, organized the root cellar by category and expiration, even fixed the loose board in the floor that he'd been stepping over for 3 years. The cabin stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a home. But winter wasn't done testing them. The second storm hit 3 days before Christmas. Not that they were celebrating, but Elias still tracked the date out of habit. This one came faster than the first, without the warning signs he'd learned to read. The sky just opened up and dumped snow mixed with ice, wind screaming down from the peaks hard enough to make the cabin walls shudder. They'd been outside when it started. Elias was splitting wood, Marisol was checking the northern traps. He saw the sky change and knew immediately they were in trouble. He dropped the axe and ran, following Marisol's trail through the snow, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found her 100 yards from the cabin, fighting her way back through wind that was trying to shove her sideways. She'd gotten turned around somehow, happened easy in whiteout conditions, and was heading west when she needed to go south. Marisol! His voice was lost in the wind, but she saw him and changed direction. They reached each other in the middle of the howling white chaos, and Elias grabbed her arm without thinking. "Cabin's that way!" He had to shout directly into her ear. "Stay close!" They made it back together, stumbling through drifts that were already knee-deep and getting worse. By the time they fell through the cabin door, they were both shaking with cold and adrenaline. Elias slammed the door shut and latched it, then turned to check on Marisol. She was leaning against the wall, breathing hard, her face pale under the wool scarf. "I couldn't see," she said, her voice shaking. "I thought I knew the way back, but everything looked the same, and I couldn't—" "You're okay." Elias was pulling off her ice-crusted coat, checking her hands and face for frostbite. Her fingers were white at the tips, but not frozen. Close, though, too close. "You're okay. Get by the fire. I'll heat water." She didn't argue, just moved to the stove and held her hands out to the warmth. Elias could see her shaking, not just from cold, but from the realization of how badly that could have gone. He'd seen men die 50 feet from their own cabins, frozen because they'd gotten disoriented and wandered the wrong direction. He'd almost watched it happen to Marisol. The thought made his hands shake as he heated water, made his chest tight with something that felt too much like fear. "I'm sorry," Marisol said suddenly. "I should have turned back when I saw the sky. I thought I had time." "We both thought wrong." Elias poured hot water into a basin and brought it to her. "Put your hands in this. Slow. It's going to hurt when feeling comes back." She did as he said, hissing when her frozen fingers hit the warm water. Elias knelt beside her, watching her face for signs of shock or hypothermia. Her color was coming back, but she was still shaking. Outside, the storm raged with a fury that made the first one seem gentle. The wind found every gap in the walls, every weakness in the shutters, and exploited them. The cabin groaned under the assault, timbers creaking, roof straining. Snow came through the chimney despite the damper, melting on the hot stove with angry hisses. "This is bad," Marisol said quietly, stating what they both knew. "Yeah." Elias stood up and started moving through the cabin, checking seals, reinforcing weak points. "We need to weatherproof while we can. Storm like this, we might be trapped inside for days." They worked together, stuffing rags into gaps, banking the fire high enough to keep them warm, but not so high it would burn through their wood supply too fast. Elias nailed an extra board across the door to reinforce it. Marisol brought up extra food from the root cellar so they wouldn't have to go down there if the cold got bad enough to make the ladder dangerous. By the time they'd done everything they could do, night had fallen and the storm showed no signs of stopping. They sat by the fire, eating a cold dinner because neither of them wanted to waste energy cooking, and listened to the mountain try to kill them. "Tell me something," Marisol said suddenly. Elias looked at her. She was staring into the fire, her expression distant. "Anything. Just talk. I need to hear something besides the wind." He understood. The sound of the storm was maddening, constant, overwhelming, a reminder that the only thing between them and death was wood and nails and hope. So he talked. He told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, about his father's forge, and the way metal sang when you worked it right. He told her about the war, carefully editing out the worst parts, focusing on the strange moments of beauty that had existed even in hell. A sunrise over a battlefield, the way men sang to keep their spirits up. the letters from home that had kept him sane. Marisol listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving the fire. When he ran out of safe stories, she started talking too. She told him about her village, about the way the light looked on the mountains at sunset, about her mother's garden and her father's laugh, and the boy she'd married who'd had kind eyes and rough hands and had died before she'd really known him. They talked through the night, trading stories like currency, building a bridge across the silence that had existed between them. And somewhere in the telling, Elias realized that this was what he'd been missing. Not romance, not grand gestures, but simple human connection. Someone to talk to when the darkness pressed in. Someone who understood that survival was more than just staying alive. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days trapped inside the cabin with no way to get outside, no way to know if the roof would hold or the walls would crack or the chimney would collapse and fill the cabin with smoke. They rationed food and water, kept the fire as low as they dared, and waited. On the second day, one of the shutters broke. The wind tore it clean off its hinges, and suddenly freezing air was pouring into the cabin through the exposed window. Elias grabbed boards and nails, trying to seal it from the inside, while the wind fought him for every inch. Marisol held the boards in place while he hammered, both of them working against the storm's fury. And when they finally got it sealed, they collapsed on the floor, breathing hard, covered in snow that had blown in during the fight. "We're not going to make it," Marisol said, her voice flat. "Yes, we are." Elias was checking the seal, making sure it would hold. "We've made it this far. 3 more months of winter, maybe 4. We can't." "We can." He turned to look at her, saw the fear in her eyes that she'd been hiding since the storm started. "Listen to me. I've survived 6 winters alone in this cabin. You've survived 5 years alone in the world. We're both still breathing. That means we're tougher than we think we are." "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely audible over the wind. "Good. That means you're smart." Elias moved to sit beside her, their backs against the wall, shoulders touching. "Fear keeps you careful, keeps you alive. The people who aren't scared up here are the ones who die doing stupid things because they think the mountain cares about their confidence." She laughed, a sound that was more exhale than humor. "That's terrible advice." "It's honest advice." He could feel her shaking, cold or fear or exhaustion, probably all 3. "We're going to make it, Marisol. Not because we're lucky or blessed or meant to be here, because we're going to work every day to survive, and we're going to do it together. That's the only promise I can make you. But it's the only promise that matters." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face for something, truth maybe, or hope, or just confirmation that he meant what he said. Whatever she found must have been enough, because she nodded and leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the storm, feeling each other breathe. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly comfortable, but it was real, and it was what they both needed, proof that they weren't alone, that there was another person in the world who gave a damn whether they lived or died. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. The wind stopped, the snow tapered off, and when Elias opened the door, the world outside was buried under 6 feet of new snow. The path they'd cleared was gone. The woodpile was invisible. Even the landscape had changed, familiar shapes hidden under smooth white curves that could have been anything. "We need to dig out," he said, stating the obvious. Marisol was already pulling on her coat. "Then let's dig." They worked for hours, clearing the door, cutting a new path to the woodpile, checking the cabin's exterior for damage. The broken shutter was gone, torn away completely, and probably buried somewhere in the snow. They'd have to replace it before the next storm or risk losing heat they couldn't spare. But they were alive. The cabin had held. And when Elias looked at Marisol working beside him, her face flushed with cold and effort, he felt something shift inside his chest. Not the absence of hopelessness, but the presence of something else. Something that might have been trust, or partnership, or the beginning of understanding that he wasn't doing this alone anymore. That night, after they'd eaten and checked the seals and prepared as best they could for whatever came next, Marisol climbed halfway up to the loft and then stopped. "Elias?" He looked up from banking the fire. "Yeah?" "Thank you. For coming to find me in the storm, for—" She trailed off, searching for words. "For not giving up. On you or on me?" "Both, maybe." Elias met her eyes and saw the same exhaustion he felt, the same determination to keep going despite everything. We're partners, he said. That means we don't give up on each other. That's the deal. She smiled. A small thing, barely there, but real. That's the deal, she agreed. And then she climbed up to the loft, and Elias was left alone with the fire and the knowledge that something had changed between them. Something fundamental and important and terrifying in its implications. They'd stopped being strangers sharing a space and become something else, allies maybe, or friends, or the first fragile foundation of whatever came after survival became routine instead of crisis. The mountain didn't care. It would keep testing them, keep trying to break them, keep demanding more than they thought they could give. But for the first time since the seventh bride had run, Elias thought they might actually have a chance, not because the work would get easier or the winter would be kind, but because Marisol had stayed through the worst storm he'd seen in 6 years, had worked beside him when it would have been easier to panic, had looked at him in the dark and chosen trust over fear. That had to count for something. That had to be enough to build on. And as sleep pulled him under, Elias let himself imagine, carefully, cautiously, like touching something that might burn, what it would be like if she kept staying. If winter ended and spring came and she was still here, still choosing this life, still choosing him. The thought should have scared him. Instead, it felt like the first warm thing he'd felt in years. January came with cold so severe it felt personal. The kind of cold that found its way through every layer of clothing, every sealed crack in the walls, every carefully banked fire. Elias woke one morning to find ice crystals forming on the inside of the shutters, his breath visible even wrapped in blankets by the stove. Marisol was already awake, crouched by the fire, trying to coax more heat from wood that wanted to smolder instead of burn. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, her movement slower than usual. They'd been running on short sleep and rationed food for weeks, the storm having trapped them longer than expected and eaten through supplies they couldn't afford to lose. Fire's not catching right, she said without looking up. Wood's too cold. Need to bring it inside earlier. Let it warm up before we burn it. I know. Elias pushed himself up, every joint protesting. He was 32 but felt twice that. I'll bring some in today. We're low on everything. Marisol finally got the fire going properly and sat back on her heels. Flour's almost gone. Coffee, too. We've got dried meat and beans, but that won't last past February if we don't supplement with fresh game. She wasn't complaining, just stating facts. But the facts were grim enough without embellishment. Elias had been counting supplies in his head for weeks, running calculations that never added up the way he needed them to. The storm had cost them, not just in food eaten while trapped inside, but in lost hunting days, damaged equipment, energy spent on repairs instead of gathering. Traps have been empty for a week, he said. Animals are holed up somewhere we can't reach them. Fish aren't biting through the ice. I can try to get farther out, see if... No, Marisol's voice was sharp. You go too far out in this cold, you don't come back. We stick to what we can reach safely. We need food. We need you alive. She stood up, brushing ice from her knees. We'll make the supplies stretch. We've done it this far. They had, but Elias could see the cost in her face and the way her clothes hung looser than they had in November. She was burning through her body's reserves the same way he was, and there was only so much a person could lose before they started losing things that didn't come back. The tension between them had been building for days, not anger exactly, but something sharper. The stress of constant survival, of never being warm enough or fed enough, of watching winter tighten its grip with no relief in sight. They were both on edge, both exhausted, both running out of the patience that had carried them through December. I'm going to check the western line, Elias said, pulling on his coat. Even if the traps are empty, I need to reset them. It's too cold. Wait until afternoon. The temperature might... I'm going now. He didn't mean to snap, but the words came out harder than intended. I've been doing this for 6 years, Marisol. I know when it's safe. She went very still. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. Fine. Do what you want. He should have apologized, should have recognized the hurt underneath her calm. But he was too cold and too hungry and too tired of everything being a negotiation, a calculation, a carefully measured risk. He grabbed his rifle and walked out into the January morning without another word. The cold hit him like a wall. Not the sharp sting of November cold, but something deeper, more invasive. The kind of cold that stopped being a sensation and became a fact of existence. His lungs burned with each breath. His eyes watered and the tears froze on his cheeks. By the time he reached the first trap, empty, buried under snow that had refrozen into something like concrete, his hands were already going numb despite thick gloves. He should turn back. He knew that. But something stubborn and stupid kept him moving forward, checking trap after trap, resetting mechanisms that probably wouldn't catch anything anyway. Pride, maybe. Or the need to prove that he could still do this, that he hadn't become soft or dependent, that he was still the man who'd survived alone for 6 years before Marisol showed up. The fourth trap was different. Something had been there. Broken branches, scattered blood, signs of a struggle. Whatever had gotten caught had also gotten free, probably taking part of the trap mechanism with it. Elias knelt in the snow, trying to assess the damage with hands that barely responded to his commands. And that's when he realized how bad things had gotten. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. Not numb, absent, like they belonged to someone else. His feet were the same, and when he tried to stand up, his legs didn't want to cooperate. The cold had gotten past his defenses while he was focused on the trap, and now it was winning. He needed to get back to the cabin. Now. But when he looked around, everything looked the same, white on white on white. Familiar landmarks buried or transformed. The sun was a pale disk behind clouds, giving no real indication of direction. He'd been so focused on the traps that he hadn't paid attention to how far he'd wandered. Panic tried to claw its way up his throat. He forced it down. Panic killed people faster than cold. He needed to think, needed to remember his training, needed to... A gunshot cracked through the air. Single shot coming from the south. Then another, 3 seconds later. The pattern he'd taught Marisol weeks ago. 2 shots, spaced apart, meant, I need help finding you. He pulled his rifle up with hands that barely worked and fired twice into the air, the same pattern. Answer received. Then he started moving toward where he thought the first shots had come from, fighting through snow that grabbed at his legs, praying he was going the right direction. He almost walked past her. Marisol stood between 2 trees he should have recognized, wrapped in her heavy coat, her rifle in her hands. Her face was white with cold and fear. "You idiot," she said, her voice shaking. "You complete idiot." "I know. You could have died out here." "I know." She grabbed his arm and pulled him close enough to see his face clearly. Whatever she saw there made her expression shift from anger to something worse, genuine fear. "Your lips are blue. How long have you been out here?" "Don't know. Lost track." His words were slurring together. Bad sign. Very bad sign. Marisol didn't waste time arguing. She got under his shoulder, taking most of his weight, and started dragging him back toward the cabin. Elias tried to help, tried to keep his feet moving, but his body wasn't responding the way it should. Everything felt distant and slow, like he was watching himself from somewhere far away. He had no memory of reaching the cabin. The next thing he knew clearly, he was on the floor by the stove, and Marisol was pulling off his boots with shaking hands. "Don't move!" Her voice was sharp, all business. "You've got frostbite. If I warm you up too fast, you'll lose fingers. Maybe toes. Just stay still and let me work." She knew what she was doing. Elias watched through a haze as she filled basins with lukewarm water, tested the temperature carefully, then started immersing his hands and feet in slow stages. The pain when feelings started coming back was intense enough to make him gasp, then worse, then unbearable. He bit down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming. "I know," Marisol said quietly, her hands steady even though he could see tears on her face. "I know it hurts, but it means you're still alive. The parts that hurt are the parts we can save." It took hours. Slow, careful warming, checking his skin for signs of permanent damage, wrapping everything that could be saved. By the time she was done, Elias was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Marisol looked worse, drained and pale and older than she had that morning. "I'm sorry," he said when he could speak without his teeth chattering. "Shut up." She was making coffee, her movements mechanical. "You don't get to apologize for almost dying because you were too proud to admit I was right." "Marisol." "No!" She spun to face him, and all the fear and anger she'd been holding back came pouring out. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to tell me we're partners and then go off alone doing something dangerous because you need to prove you don't need me. That's not partnership. That's suicide with extra steps." She was right. Elias knew she was right, but hearing it said out loud, seeing the hurt in her eyes, made something crack open inside his chest. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was stupid and proud, and I almost got myself killed because I couldn't stand feeling like I'd become weak." "Weak?" Marisol laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think accepting help is weak? You think survival is something you have to do alone to prove you're strong? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, and I've heard a lot of stupid things. He stopped, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. "For 6 years, I survived alone. I didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone. And then you showed up, and suddenly I do need you. I need your help and your skills and your company, and I don't know how to be that person, the person who needs someone else." The silence that followed was heavy. Marisol stared at him, her expression unreadable, and Elias waited for her to say something cutting, something that would confirm every fear he had about being too broken to deserve partnership. Instead, she said, "You think I don't know that feeling?" He looked up, surprised. "I came here because I was tired of being alone," she continued, her voice softer now. "But I was also terrified, because being alone meant I couldn't lose anyone else. Couldn't watch someone I cared about die and know I was helpless to stop it. Being alone was safer. Lonelier, but safer." She sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "And then I got here, and you were this stubborn, half-wild man who clearly needed help but was too proud to ask for it. And I thought, he's going to die if I don't stay. But if I stay and he dies anyway, it'll break something in me that can't be fixed." Elias felt something shift in his understanding. "Why did you stay?" "Because I was tired of being safe." She met his eyes directly. "Because I'd rather risk getting hurt again than spend the rest of my life hiding from anything that might matter. Because when I saw this place, saw you, I thought, maybe we can save each other. Or maybe we'll just both survive a little longer. But either way, it's better than being alone." The honesty in her words hit him harder than the cold had. This was what he'd been missing, not just help with the work, not just another body to share the cabin, but someone who understood what it meant to be scared and keep going anyway. Someone who'd chosen to be here knowing exactly what it cost. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be whatever we're becoming. Neither do I." Marisol's smile was tired but real. "But I know we can't do it if you get yourself killed trying to prove you don't need help. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay inside for the next 3 days and let your hands and feet heal. I'm going to handle the traps and the water and everything else. And you're going to sit here and think about whether you actually want a partner or if you just wanted someone to watch you survive alone." The challenge in her voice was clear. This was a turning point, and they both knew it. Elias could double down on his isolation, keep trying to prove he didn't need anyone, and eventually push her away the same way he'd pushed away everyone else. Or he could do something harder, admit that needing someone wasn't weakness, that letting someone help wasn't failure, that maybe survival wasn't supposed to be a solo achievement. "I want a partner," he said, the words feeling strange but true. "A real one, not just someone who helps with the work, someone who—" He struggled to articulate what he meant. "Someone who matters." Marisol's expression softened. "Then act like it. Because partners don't keep secrets about how bad things are. Partners don't take stupid risks alone. Partners trust each other enough to be honest, even when the truth is ugly." "Okay." Elias took a breath. "Then here's the truth. I'm scared. I'm scared we're not going to make it through winter. I'm scared that even if we do, you'll realize you made a mistake and leave anyway. I'm scared that I'm starting to care about you too much, and if something happens to you, it'll destroy me. And I'm scared that I'm not worth staying for." The words came out raw and unfiltered, all the things he'd been carrying for weeks. Marisol didn't flinch. She just listened, her dark eyes steady on his face, and when he finished, she nodded like he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "I'm scared too," she said. "Scared I'm not strong enough for this. Scared I'll fail the same way I failed everyone else I ever cared about. Scared that you'll realize I'm just a woman who's running from ghosts and decide I'm not worth the trouble." She set down her coffee cup. "But you know what I'm more scared of? Going back to being alone. So if we're going to do this, really do this, we need to stop protecting ourselves from each other and start protecting each other from this place." Elias felt something settle in his chest, something that had been jagged and painful for so long he'd stopped noticing it. What does that look like? Honestly? Marisol stood up and started checking his bandaged hands with gentle, efficient movements. I don't know, but I think it starts with being truthful about what we need, what we want, what scares us. No more pretending we're fine when we're not. No more running off alone because we're too proud to ask for help. And if I ask for help and you can't give it, then we figure it out together. That's what partnership means. She finished checking his hands and looked at him seriously. But Elias, I need you to understand something. I can't save you. You can't save me. We're both too damaged for that. But we can keep each other alive. We can make this survivable. That's not romance, but it might be something better, something real. He'd spent 6 years believing that romance was what made a marriage work, and he'd been wrong every time. But this, brutal honesty, shared fear, mutual survival, this felt like something that could actually last. Not because it was easy or beautiful, but because it was built on truth instead of hope. Something real, he repeated. I can work with that. Good. Marisol grabbed her coat from the peg. Because I'm going out to check those traps now, and you're going to stay here and rest. And if you try to follow me, I swear I'll tie you to that bed. You're going alone? One of us has to. She pulled on her gloves, checked her rifle. And it's not going to be the man with frostbitten hands who almost died this morning. I'll be back before dark. Keep the fire going. She was out the door before he could argue. Elias sat by the stove, listening to her footsteps fade into the snow, fighting every instinct that told him to follow her, to protect her, to not let her face the danger alone. But that was the old way of thinking. The way that said he had to carry everything himself, that accepting help was failure. The new way, the way Marisol was teaching him, meant trusting that she could handle herself, that she was competent and capable and didn't need him to be her protector. That partnership meant letting each other be strong in different ways. It was harder than he'd expected. Every minute she was gone felt like an hour. He kept checking the window, watching for movement in the white landscape, imagining every disaster that could befall her. But she'd been right that morning. The cold was too severe for him to go out, and his hands were in no condition for the work. Staying inside was the smart choice, even if it felt like cowardice. She came back 3 hours later, her face red with cold but alive, carrying 2 rabbits she'd managed to trap. Elias felt relief so intense it made him dizzy. Told you I'd be back, she said, setting the rabbits on the table. Fire's still going. You followed orders. Maybe there's hope for us yet. They prepared the rabbits together, working in the familiar silence that had become comfortable instead of awkward. Marisol did the skinning with practiced efficiency while Elias prepared vegetables from the root cellar. His hands were clumsy with the bandages, but he managed. That night they ate rabbit stew that tasted better than it had any right to, and the cabin felt warmer than it had in weeks. Not because the fire was burning hotter, but because something had shifted between them. They'd faced truth together, ugly truth, scared truth, truth that made them both vulnerable and hadn't broken. Can I ask you something? Elias said after they'd cleaned up. Depends on the question. Your husband, the one who died. Did you love him? Marisol was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee. I thought I did. But we were both so young, and we barely knew each other. I loved the idea of him more than the reality. And when he died, I felt guilty because part of me was relieved. Not that he was gone, but that I didn't have to keep pretending I knew what love was supposed to feel like. Do you know now? No. She looked at him directly. But I think I'm starting to understand what it's not. It's not the breathless feeling you get at the beginning, the way stories make it sound. It's not about completing each other or finding your other half. I think it's simpler than that, and harder. It's choosing someone every day, even when it would be easier to choose yourself. It's showing up when things are difficult. It's being honest when lying would hurt less. Elias felt his throat tighten. Is that what you're doing? Choosing this? Choosing me? Every day, she said simply. Even the days when you make it difficult. Even today, when you were an idiot and almost died. Especially today, because that's when it matters most. He didn't have words for what he was feeling. So he just nodded and hoped she understood what he couldn't say, that he was choosing her too, that she mattered more than his pride, that he was willing to learn how to be a partner instead of just a survivor. The rest of January passed in a pattern of work and rest, small victories and smaller defeats. Elias's hands healed slowly, the frostbite damage less severe than it could have been. Marisol proved herself over and over, not just capable, but essential, not just surviving, but improving their situation in ways he never would have thought of alone. They talked more about their pasts, their fears, the things they'd lost, and the things they hoped to find. The conversations were rarely easy, often uncomfortable, sometimes painful, but they were real in a way that nothing else had been for either of them in years. February came with slightly warmer temperatures and the first hints that winter might eventually end. The days grew longer by minutes that felt like gifts. They started talking about spring, what they'd plant if they could clear a garden plot, what repairs the cabin needed, what changes they wanted to make. One night, Marisol came down from the loft earlier than usual. Elias looked up from the book he'd been reading and found her standing by the fire, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." She didn't sit down, just stood there with her arms wrapped around herself. "What do you want from me? From this? Because we've been calling this a partnership, but we've never actually talked about what that means long term." Elias set down his book, his heart suddenly beating faster. What brought this on? The contract. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, the marriage contract from the matchmaking service, creased and worn from being carried. "It expires in April. When spring comes and Dutch shows up with the supply wagon, I could leave. Go back to wherever I came from, start over somewhere else. The contract gives me that option." He'd forgotten about that clause, or maybe he'd been deliberately not thinking about it. "Do you want to leave?" "That's not what I asked." Her voice was steady, but he could see tension in the way she held herself. "I asked what you want, because if you're just waiting for spring so you can send me away like the others, I need to know now. I need to start preparing myself." Elias stood up, moved closer to her. "I don't want you to leave. But do you want me to stay?" She met his eyes, unflinching. "Really stay?" "Not as hired help or someone filling a contract. As your wife. As someone you're building a life with. Because there's a difference, and we both know it." This was the moment. The question he'd been avoiding since the day she arrived. The choice between safety and risk, between surviving and living, between protecting himself from loss and opening himself up to the possibility of something more. "Yes," he said, the word coming out rough but certain. "I want you to stay, not because I need help surviving, though I do, not because I'm lonely, though I was, but because you're the first person in 6 years who's made me believe there might be something worth living for besides just getting through another day. You're strong and stubborn and honest in ways that scare me and challenge me and make me want to be better. And I'm terrified that I'll mess this up, or that you'll realize you deserve better, or that something will happen and I'll lose you. But I'd rather risk all of that than go back to being alone." Marisol's expression shifted, something uncertain giving way to something else. "That's the most words I've ever heard you say at once. Is it enough?" "I don't know." She moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the firelight reflected in her eyes. "Because I need to know what you're asking for. Are you asking me to stay as your wife in name only? Separate lives in the same house? Or are you asking for something more?" Elias felt his pulse hammering. This was the cliff edge, the moment where everything could change or everything could break. "I'm asking for more. I'm asking for a real marriage. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Someone I trust enough to be honest with. Someone who trusts me back. Someone who..." He struggled for the right words. "Someone who sees all the broken parts and decides to stay anyway." "And you see my broken parts?" "Every one of them." "And you still want this?" "More than I've wanted anything in years." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for doubt or deception or fear. Whatever she found must have satisfied her, because she reached up and touched his face with her calloused hand. "Then yes," she said quietly, "I'll stay. Not because of a contract or because winter isn't over or because I don't have anywhere else to go, but because I choose this. I choose you, every difficult, stubborn, half-wild part of you." Elias felt something break open in his chest. Not pain, but relief so intense it felt like pain. He pulled her close, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting. She held him back just as tight, and they stood there by the fire, Two damaged people who'd somehow found each other in the worst possible place and decided that maybe damaged together was better than whole apart. "We're going to fight," Marisol said against his shoulder. "We're going to drive each other crazy. There are going to be days when we both wonder what the hell we were thinking. I know. And it's not going to be romantic. It's going to be hard work and compromise and figuring things out as we go." "I know that too." "Good." She pulled back enough to look at him. "Because I'm not one of those women in stories who's going to make everything better just by existing. I'm going to make demands. I'm going to expect things from you. I'm going to hold you accountable when you're being stupid. I'm counting on it." She smiled then, real and full, and Elias felt something in him respond that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with being alive. He kissed her, tentative at first, then less so when she kissed him back. It wasn't the desperate passion of storybooks, but something quieter, more deliberate. A promise being made in the most physical way possible. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Marisol's cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. "Well," she said, "that's new." "Good new or bad new?" "Too soon to tell." But she was smiling when she said it, and her hand was still holding his. "We should probably talk about logistics. I can't keep sleeping in the loft if we're actually married." "No, you can't." Elias looked at his narrow cot in the corner. "We'll need to build a proper bed, big enough for two. And we'll need to figure out how this works. Living together, actually together, setting boundaries and expectations and—" "Marisol," he squeezed her hand, "we don't have to figure it all out tonight. We've got time." She laughed, and the sound filled the cabin with something it had been missing for years. Joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy. "Listen to you, being patient and reasonable. Who are you, and what have you done with Elias Crow? He's still here, but he's learning." Elias pulled her back toward the fire, and they sat down together, shoulders touching, hands still linked. "Learning that some things are worth the risk, that asking for what you want doesn't make you weak, that maybe I don't have to do everything alone." "Good." Marisol rested her head on his shoulder, a gesture that felt both natural and impossibly intimate. "Because I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me now." "Promise?" "Promise." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and reminding them that winter wasn't done yet. But inside the cabin, something had changed. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building something, fragile still, uncertain, but real in a way that nothing else had been. The mountain would keep testing them. The cold would keep trying to break them. The isolation would keep pushing them to their limits. But they'd face it together now. Not as strangers bound by a contract, not as two people running from different ghosts, but as partners who'd chosen each other in full knowledge of what it would cost. And if that wasn't love yet, it was close enough to build on, close enough to believe in, close enough to risk everything for. The bed took them 4 days to build. Elias had lumber stored in the lean-to behind the cabin, pine logs he'd cut 2 summers ago with vague plans to expand the place someday. That someday had never come, and the wood had sat there gathering snow and moss while he convinced himself he didn't need more space for a life he was living alone. Now, with Marisol measuring and planning and sketching rough designs in the margin of an old newspaper, someday had arrived whether he was ready or not. "It needs to be sturdy," she said, chewing on the end of a pencil. "These mountain winters we're going to be spending a lot of time in bed, just sleeping," she added quickly, seeing his expression. "I'm talking about cold nights when there's nothing else to do but stay warm under blankets." "I know what you meant." Elias was sorting through the lumber, checking each piece for rot or insect damage. Most of it was still good, but some would need to be discarded. "We'll need a frame strong enough to hold a straw mattress. The one I've got now is barely big enough for me. We'll make a new one. I saw cattails down by the creek before it froze. When the thaw comes, we can harvest them, dry them out. Better than straw for keeping shape." She looked up from her sketching. "You're sure about this? Once we build it, there's no pretending we're just—" "I'm sure." And he was. The nervousness was there, the fear of making himself vulnerable, but underneath it was something stronger, certainty. "Are you?" Marisol set down the pencil and met his eyes. "I wouldn't be planning furniture if I wasn't." They worked in the cold workshop area of the lean-to, their breath coming out in clouds, hands stiff even with gloves. Elias handled the heavy cutting and sawing while Marisol measured and fitted joints with a precision that surprised him until he remembered she'd grown up in a village where everyone knew how to build and repair their own homes. "Your father teach you this too?" he asked, watching her notch a crossbeam with confident strokes. "My mother, actually. She was better with her hands than he ever was. Could fix anything, build anything." Marisol blew sawdust off the wood and checked her work. She used to say that women who waited for men to solve their problems ended up with a lot of broken things and a lot of disappointment. Sounds like a practical woman. She was. Something shifted in Marisol's expression. Grief, maybe, or just the weight of memory. "She would have liked you, I think. You don't make promises you can't keep." The frame came together slowly, piece by piece. Elias had forgotten what it felt like to build something with another person, to have someone anticipate what he needed before he asked, to work in the kind of rhythm that came from paying attention to each other's movements. It felt good. More than good. It felt right in a way that made him wonder how he'd managed 6 years without it. On the third day, while they were sanding the headboard smooth, Marisol said, "We need to talk about what happens when Dutch comes back." Elias's hand stilled on the sandpaper. "What about it?" "He's going to bring mail, probably another contract from the matchmaking service, maybe even another bride if the timing's wrong." She kept working, her strokes steady and even. "We need to decide how we're handling that." He hadn't thought about it, had been too focused on the present to consider the future complications. But she was right. Dutch would come up the mountain as soon as the pass cleared, bringing supplies and mail and questions about why the 8th bride was still here when all the others had left. "I'll tell him we're married," Elias said. "Really married, not just on paper. I'll send word back to the service that they should close my file." "And if they've already sent someone? Then she goes back down the mountain the same day she came up." He set down the sandpaper and looked at Marisol directly. "I meant what I said. I'm not interested in anyone else. This isn't about keeping my options open. This is about you and me figuring out how to build a life together." She nodded slowly, something like relief crossing her face. "Okay, good. I just needed to hear you say it. Needed to know I'm not—" She trailed off, searching for words. "Not what? Not a placeholder. Not the woman who stayed because winter made it impossible to leave. Not the best option in a bad situation." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the vulnerability underneath. "I need to know you actually want me here." Elias moved closer to her, cupped her face in his rough hands. "I want you here. Not because you're convenient or because I'm desperate, but because you're the first person I've met who doesn't need me to be anything other than what I am. You see all the broken parts and you're still here, still choosing this. That's not settling. That's—" He struggled to find the right word. "That's everything." She kissed him then, quick and fierce, tasting like sawdust and coffee. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "Finish the bed," she said. "I'm tired of sleeping alone in the loft." They finished it the next day. The bed was simple but solid. 4 posts, a sturdy frame, rope webbing to support the mattress they'd make later. It barely fit in the corner of the cabin, taking up space that had been used for storage, but neither of them cared. They moved it into place together, adjusted it until it sat level on the uneven floor, then stood back to look at what they'd built. "It's not much," Elias said. "It's ours." Marisol was already pulling blankets from her trunk, the heavy wool ones she'd brought from New Mexico. "That makes it enough." That night they lay side by side in the new bed, both still dressed, both acutely aware of the other's presence in a way that was exciting and terrifying in equal measure. The cabin was dark except for the banked fire, the temperature already dropping as night settled in. "This is strange," Marisol said after a long silence. "Good strange or bad strange?" "Just strange. I haven't shared a bed with anyone since—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Elias understood. Her husband had been dead for over a decade. She'd been alone almost as long as he had. "We don't have to—" he started, but she cut him off. "I know we don't have to, but I want to, eventually. Just not yet. Is that okay?" "It's more than okay." He reached over and found her hand in the darkness. "We've got time to figure things out. No rush." She squeezed his hand. "You're being very patient." "I'm being realistic. We've known each other for 3 months. We're still learning how to be in the same room without driving each other crazy. Adding more complications right now would be stupid." Who are you, and what have you done with Elias Crow? But there was laughter in her voice, warm and genuine. They fell asleep like that, hands linked between them, and Elias slept better than he had in years. March came in like a promise. The temperature climbed above freezing during the day, and the snow started to melt in earnest. Water dripped from the roof in a constant patter, and the creek swelled with runoff until it became a roaring torrent. The world outside transformed from white to brown to the first hints of green as stubborn plants pushed through the last patches of snow. Elias and Marisol worked from dawn to dusk, making repairs the winter had delayed, preparing for the growing season ahead. They cleared a plot for the garden, arguing good-naturedly about what to plant and where. Marisol wanted vegetables they could preserve for next winter. Elias wanted practical things that wouldn't require much maintenance. They compromised on both, sketching out rows and making lists of seeds to request when Dutch arrived. The physical work felt different now that they were sharing the bed, not because anything had changed between them physically. They were still taking things slow, still learning each other's boundaries, but because the partnership felt more real, more permanent. They'd wake up together, work together, eat together, fall asleep together, and the rhythm of it became as natural as breathing. But the ease between them made Elias nervous in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Things were going too well. The winter had ended without major disaster. They had enough food left over to get them through to the first harvest. The cabin was in better shape than it had been in years. Marisol showed no signs of changing her mind or regretting her choice. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. "You're brooding again," Marisol said one afternoon. They were working on the garden fence, driving posts into the half-frozen ground. "I can hear you thinking from over here." "I'm not brooding." "You absolutely are. You get this look on your face like you're expecting disaster." She wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. "What's wrong?" Elias hammered another post, buying time. "Nothing's wrong. That's the problem." "That doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to make sense. It's just how I feel." He set down the hammer and looked at her. "The other times, the other brides, things would be fine for a while. Then something would happen. They'd realize what they'd gotten themselves into, or they'd get scared, or they'd just wake up one day and decide they couldn't do it anymore. I keep waiting for that moment with you." Marisol was quiet for a moment, studying him. Then she walked over and grabbed his face in both her dirt-smudged hands. "Listen to me. I am not them. I'm not going to wake up one day and decide I've made a mistake. I'm not waiting for the perfect moment to run. I chose this with my eyes open, knowing exactly how hard it would be. And yeah, it's been hard. It's been freezing and exhausting, and there were days I wanted to scream because you're stubborn and impossible, and you make everything more difficult than it needs to be. Besotti. You're not really selling this. I'm not done." Her grip tightened, but even on those days I never regretted staying. Because you're also honest and capable, and you don't give up even when everything's falling apart. You showed me that survival doesn't have to be a solo project, that asking for help isn't weakness, that maybe I can trust someone again without it destroying me if things go wrong. Elias felt his throat tighten. What if things do go wrong? Then we deal with it together. That's what this is about. Not avoiding disaster, but knowing we can survive it if it comes. She let go of his face and picked up her post driver. "Now stop waiting for me to leave and help me finish this fence. We've got work to do." She was right. She was always right about these things. Elias grabbed his hammer and went back to work, and the knot in his chest loosened a little. Not all the way. He'd been bracing for loss too long to let it go completely, but enough that he could breathe easier. 3 days later, they heard the wagon. Elias was on the roof, replacing shingles that had blown off during the winter storms. Marisol was below, handing up supplies and making sarcastic comments about his ability to walk in a straight line on a pitched surface. The sound of wheels and horse hooves carried clear through the mountain air, unmistakable. Dutch was early. The pass must have cleared faster than expected. Elias climbed down from the roof, his heart beating faster than the physical exertion warranted. This was it. The moment when theory became practice, when their private decisions became public reality. Dutch would have questions, might have another bride in his wagon, would definitely have opinions about the 8th woman still being here when all the others had fled. "You okay?" Marisol asked, watching his face. "Yeah, just nervous." "Don't be." She squeezed his arm. "We know what we want. We know what we're doing. Dutch's opinion doesn't change that. The wagon rolled into the clearing, and Dutch climbed down with the stiff movements of a man who'd spent too many hours on a hard bench. He looked older than he had in November, more gray in his beard, deeper lines around his eyes. The mountain was hard on everyone, even the ones who only visited. "Crow," he said by way of greeting. Then his gaze shifted to Marisol, and his eyebrows went up. "Miss Vega, didn't expect to see you still here." "It's Mrs. Crow now," Marisol said evenly. "We got married in January." Dutch's expression cycled through surprise, skepticism, and finally something that might have been approval. "That's so? Well, guess 8 times the charm then." He started unloading supplies from the wagon: flour, coffee, salt, sugar, other staples they'd ordered months ago. "Got mail for you too, some from the matchmaking service, some from other places." Elias took the letters Dutch handed him. 3 from the service, their envelopes official and impersonal. 1 from the territorial government, probably taxes, and 1 in handwriting he didn't recognize, addressed to Mrs. Marisol Crow. "That one came to the service first," Dutch explained. "They forwarded it up here since it had your wife's name on it. Figured it was important." Marisol took the letter with hands that shook slightly. She stared at the handwriting like she was seeing a ghost. "You know who it's from?" Elias asked quietly. "My cousin. In Santa Fe. I didn't think—" She looked up at him, her expression complicated. "I didn't think anyone from my old life would try to find me. You want privacy to read it?" She nodded, already walking toward the cabin. Elias watched her go, then turned back to Dutch, who was pretending not to have noticed the exchange. "So," Dutch said, pulling down another crate, "you two really married, or is this just for show until she can get down the mountain?" "Really married." Elias started helping with the supplies, glad to have something to do with his hands. "I know you've got no reason to believe me, but it's the truth. She stayed through the worst of winter. We built a life together, made it work. She knows what she's signing up for. It's one thing to survive a winter. It's another to commit to doing it over and over, year after year, until you're both old and broken and wondering why you chose the hardest possible life. She knows." Elias grabbed a sack of flour. "And she chose it anyway, same as I did." Dutch studied him for a long moment. "You're different. Don't know if it's good different or just different, but there's something changed about you. That what you're telling everyone in town? That the hermit on the mountain finally found someone willing to put up with him?" "I'm telling them you're off the matchmaking services list and they should stop gossiping about how many brides you've run through." Dutch handed him the last crate. "For what it's worth, Crow, I hope it works out. That woman's got spine, more than the others. If anyone can make a go of it up here, it's probably her." It wasn't exactly a blessing, but coming from Dutch, it was close enough. They finished unloading in silence, and Dutch climbed back into his wagon, ready to head down the mountain before the afternoon weather turned. "I'll be back in June with the next supply run," he called. "You need anything before then, you're on your own." "We'll manage." Dutch nodded and snapped the reins. The wagon rolled away, leaving Elias alone in the clearing with a pile of supplies and the knowledge that their private life was now a matter of public record. The matchmaking service would close his file. Word would spread through the mountain communities. The 8th bride had stayed. Against all odds and expectations, Elias Crow had found someone willing to build a life in the place everyone else had fled. He found Marisol sitting on the bed, the letter open in her lap, tears streaming down her face. Elias's heart clenched. He crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not crowding. "What happened?" "My cousin." Marisol's voice was thick. "She's been trying to find me for 2 years. Someone told her I'd gone west, but the trail went cold in Denver. She finally contacted the matchmaking service asking if they had any record of me. They forwarded her letter here. What does she want?" "To know I'm alive, to know I'm safe." Marisol wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "To tell me that the village, the people who blamed me for my husband's death, they're gone. Scattered. Some died, some moved away. The ones who are left don't remember or don't care. I could come back if I wanted. She says I'd be welcome." Elias felt cold spread through his chest. "Do you want to go back?" "No." The answer came fast and certain. "That life is over. Has been for years. But knowing I'm not running anymore, I'm just choosing something different. That matters." She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. Does that make sense? Yeah. He pulled her close, and she came without resistance, burying her face in his shoulder. It makes sense. There's a difference between having to stay and choosing to stay. I'm choosing to stay, she said against his shirt. I need you to know that. This isn't about having no other options. This is about wanting this life, wanting you, even though I could have something easier. I know. He held her while she cried, not from sadness, but from the complicated relief of learning that ghosts didn't have as much power as you'd given them, that forgiveness was possible even when you hadn't asked for it, that the past could release its grip if you gave it long enough. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were swollen, but she was smiling. I'm going to write her back, tell her about the cabin, about the mountains, about you. She'll probably think I've lost my mind. Have you? Probably. Marisol kissed him, soft and salt-flavored from tears. But I'm okay with that. They spent the rest of the day putting away supplies and making plans. The flour and coffee would last them through summer. The garden would give them vegetables come fall. They had enough ammunition to hunt and enough salt to preserve meat. They were set for another year, maybe longer if they were careful. That night, lying in bed with Marisol curled against his side, Elias let himself think about the future in a way he hadn't allowed himself in years. Not just surviving the next winter, but building something that lasted. Adding a room to the cabin, maybe, so they'd have more space. Improving the garden each year until they were fully self-sufficient. Growing old together in this impossible place, proving that love, or whatever this practical, honest, hard-earned thing between them was, could survive anything. What are you thinking about? Marisol asked sleepily. The future. Good future or bad future? Good. He kissed the top of her head. Surprisingly good. She made a contented noise and shifted closer. Tell me. So he did. He told her about the expansion he'd been planning, about the improvements they could make, about the life they could build if they wanted it badly enough. And as he talked, he felt the last of his fear begin to dissolve. Not because he suddenly believed nothing could go wrong. The mountains had taught him better than that, but because he finally understood that Marisol was right. They didn't need to avoid disaster. They just needed to trust that they could survive it together. Spring moved into summer with startling speed. The mountains exploded with life, wildflowers covering the meadows, animals emerging from hibernation, birds returning from wherever they'd gone to escape the winter. Elias and Marisol worked the garden together, planting rows of potatoes, beans, squash, carrots. They hunted and fished and preserved everything they could. They repaired the cabin's weak points and reinforced its strong ones. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other in ways that had nothing to do with survival. Marisol sang while she worked, old songs in Spanish that her mother had taught her. Elias discovered he liked drawing and started sketching the mountains in the margins of their supply logs. They argued about stupid things and laughed about even stupider things and found that living together was easier when you weren't constantly bracing for the other person to leave. One night in July, Marisol rolled over in bed and said, I think I'm ready. Elias had been half asleep, but that woke him up completely. Ready for what? You know what? She was looking at him in the dim light from the banked fire, her expression serious. I'm ready for this to be a real marriage in every way. If you are. His heart kicked into a faster rhythm. I'm ready. Have been for a while. Just didn't want to push. I know. That's why I'm saying it now. She moved closer, her hand finding his face in the darkness. I trust you. I want this. I want you. What happened next was awkward and sweet and nothing like the stories made it sound. They were both nervous, both fumbling, both laughing at the wrong moments and apologizing for things that didn't need apologies. But it was real, and it was theirs. And when it was over, they lay tangled together in the bed they'd built. And Elias felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for as long as he could remember. That was... Marisol started, then laughed. I don't actually know what that was. It was us figuring things out. Elias pulled the blanket over them both. We'll get better at it. You sound confident. I am confident. About this, about you, about all of it. He kissed her shoulder. I love you. I don't know when it happened or how, but it did. And I wanted you to know. She was quiet for so long he worried he'd said the wrong thing. Then she said, I love you too. Even though you're impossible and stubborn and you make everything harder than it needs to be. You've mentioned that before. Because it's true. But she was smiling when she said it, and her hand found his in the darkness. But I love you anyway. Maybe because of it. You never pretended to be anything you're not. That's worth more than perfect. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Elias dreamed of gardens and summers and a future that stretched out longer than winter. August brought Dutch back with more supplies and news from the territories. The country was changing, new laws, new settlements, railroads pushing further into wilderness. The world was getting smaller, more connected, less wild. But up on the mountain, time moved differently. Elias and Marisol listened to Dutch's stories with the polite interest of people hearing about a foreign country they'd never visit. You two planning to stay up here forever? Dutch asked, loading their order of winter supplies into the cabin. No offense, but there's easier ways to live. Maybe, Marisol said, but this is ours. We built it together. That makes it worth the difficulty. Dutch shook his head but didn't argue. He'd seen enough over the years to know that some people needed hard lives to feel alive. He left with promises to return before the first snow, and Elias and Marisol went back to their work, their life, their partnership that had somehow transformed into love without either of them noticing exactly when the shift had happened. September came with cooler temperatures and the knowledge that winter was waiting just beyond the horizon. They harvested the garden, preserving everything they could, and marveled at how much food they'd managed to grow. The root cellar was fuller than it had ever been. The woodpile was stacked higher. They were prepared in ways Elias had never been alone. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset over the mountains, Marisol said, "I'm pregnant." Elias's brain stuttered to a halt. "You're what?" "Pregnant. About 3 months, I think. I wasn't sure at first, but now I am." She was looking out at the mountains, her profile calm. "I know we didn't plan for this. I know it complicates things, but I wanted you to know." 1,000 thoughts crashed through Elias's mind at once. A baby. Here. On the mountain. The dangers, the risks, the impossibility of it. They were barely surviving themselves. How could they keep a child alive in conditions that killed grown men? What if something went wrong? What if Marisol had complications? The nearest doctor was 2 days away in good weather, unreachable in bad. But underneath the panic was something else. Something that felt like joy trying to break through ice. "Say something," Marisol said quietly. "You're scaring me." "I'm terrified," Elias admitted. "And I'm excited. And I have no idea how we're going to do this. But I want to try." He took her hand. "I want this. With you. Even though it's going to be the hardest thing we've ever done." She finally looked at him, and there were tears in her eyes. "You're sure? Because once the baby comes, there's no going back. No second thoughts. We're committed to this life, this place, for years. Maybe forever." "I'm sure." And he was. For the first time in his adult life, Elias was completely certain about something beyond just survival. "We'll figure it out, the same way we've figured out everything else. Together." Marisol leaned into him, and they sat like that as the sun dropped below the mountains and darkness settled over their world. A world that was about to get more complicated, more dangerous, more impossible, but also more real, more meaningful, more worth fighting for. The mountain would test them again. Winter was coming, and it would be their first with a child on the way. There would be struggles and setbacks and moments when they both wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. But they'd face it together. Not because they were brave or blessed or destined for this, but because they'd chosen each other, chosen this life, and chosen to believe that love, messy and imperfect and hard-earned, was stronger than fear. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Winter returned with a vengeance that made the previous year look merciful. The first snow came in October, weeks earlier than expected, and it didn't stop. Day after day, the sky opened up and dumped white onto a world that was already bracing for impact. By November, they were buried under snow that reached the cabin's eaves, and Marisol was 5 months pregnant, her belly starting to show under the layers of wool she wore to stay warm. Elias watched her move around the cabin with growing anxiety he tried to hide. She was slower now, more careful with her balance, and every time she climbed down to the root cellar or reached for something on a high shelf, his heart seized with fear. The pregnancy was progressing normally as far as either of them could tell, But neither of them knew what normal really looked like. They were navigating blind, relying on Marisol's vague memories of other women in her village and the one medical book Elias had ordered from Dutch over the summer. "Stop hovering," Marisol said one morning, catching him watching her as she made breakfast. "I can still cook. I'm pregnant, not dying. I'm not hovering." "You absolutely are. You've been doing it for weeks." She cracked eggs into the pan with more force than necessary. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But treating me like I'm made of glass isn't helping either of us." She was right, but knowing that didn't make it easier to stop. Elias had spent 6 years alone, then 8 months learning to trust someone else, and now there was a third person coming who would be completely dependent on them both. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. "What if something goes wrong?" he said, voicing the fear that kept him awake at night. "What if you have complications? What if the baby comes early or there's bleeding or Then we deal with it." Marisol set down the spatula and turned to face him. "The same way we've dealt with everything else. But we can't spend the next 4 months paralyzed by what-ifs. We need to prepare for what we can control and accept that some things are out of our hands." "I don't know how to accept that." "Neither do I." She came over and took his hands in hers. "But we're going to have to learn, because in February we're going to have a baby who needs us to be steady and strong and present. Not perfect, just present." He pulled her close, careful of her growing belly, and held on like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. Because she was. Without Marisol, he'd still be the man who'd given up after the 7th bride left, slowly dying in a cabin that felt more like a tomb than a home. She'd saved him, not through some grand gesture, but through the simple act of staying, of choosing him every day, even when it would have been easier to choose herself. Now he needed to be that person for her. For them both. "Okay," he said against her hair. "Tell me what you need." They made lists, practical, detailed lists of everything they'd need for the birth and the months after. Clean cloth for diapers and bandages, extra blankets, a cradle. Elias started building one from scraps of pine, working on it late at night when Marisol was asleep. Supplies for Marisol's recovery. Formula ingredients in case she couldn't nurse, though they both hoped she could. The medical book, read and reread until Elias had memorized the chapter on childbirth, even though the clinical language did nothing to ease his terror. December brought a cold snap that froze everything solid. The water barrel inside the cabin developed a skin of ice overnight. Their breath came out in clouds, even with the fire burning. Elias wrapped Marisol in every blanket they owned and still worried she wasn't warm enough. "The baby's fine," she said one night, placing his hand on her belly so he could feel the movement inside. "Feel that. Strong kicks. Whatever else is happening, the baby's healthy." Elias felt the flutter under his palm, alien and miraculous and terrifying. A person, a whole person, growing inside Marisol, who would emerge in a few months and depend on them for everything. The reality of it hit him fresh, like he was understanding it for the first time. "We're going to be parents," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Terrifying, isn't it?" "Completely." Marisol laughed, and the sound filled the cabin with something warmer than fire. "At least we're terrified together. That has to count for something." It did. It counted for everything. January arrived with storms that made Elias grateful they'd overprepared. They were trapped inside for days at a time, the wind howling so loud they had to shout to hear each other across the cabin. Marisol was 7 months pregnant now, moving like someone carrying precious cargo, and Elias had stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. Every noise she made jerked him awake, convinced that something was wrong, that the baby was coming early, that he was about to lose everything that mattered. "You need to rest," Marisol told him, after catching him awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling. "When the baby comes, neither of us will sleep for months. You should get it while you can." "Can't." He rolled over to look at her in the dim firelight. "Every time I close my eyes, I think about all the things that could go wrong." "Name them." "What?" "Name your fears, out loud, all of them." She shifted to face him, her hand resting on her belly. "Maybe if we drag them into the light, they'll have less power." So he did. He told her he was afraid she'd die in childbirth, that the baby would be stillborn, that he wouldn't know what to do, and his ignorance would cost them both. He was afraid of being a father of failing this child the way he felt like he'd failed at everything else important in his life. He was afraid that the love he felt for her, and for this baby to be, was too big, too consuming, and if he lost them, it would destroy him completely. Marisol listened without interrupting, her eyes steady on his face. When he finally ran out of words, she said, "Now me." She told him she was afraid of the pain, of her body failing, of dying, and leaving him alone with a baby he didn't know how to care for. She was afraid the baby would be born wrong somehow, sick or damaged in ways they couldn't fix. She was afraid she'd be a terrible mother because she'd never had children before, and her own mother was long dead, taking all her wisdom with her. She was afraid that this life they'd built would collapse under the weight of parenthood, and they'd end up resenting each other and the child. When she finished, they lay in silence, all their fears spread out between them like a map of everything that could go wrong. "We're a mess," Elias said finally. "Complete disaster," Marisol agreed. "The baby doesn't stand a chance with us as parents." Absolutely doomed. But she was smiling when she said it, and so was he, because somehow naming the fears had made them smaller. Not gone, they'd never be gone, but manageable. "You know what, though?" "What?" "I think that's okay. I think maybe all parents are terrified. Maybe that's what makes you good at it. Caring enough to be scared." She found his hand in the darkness. "We're going to make mistakes. We're going to have no idea what we're doing half the time. But we'll figure it out, the same way we figured out everything else." "Together," Elias said. Together. February came quietly, without fanfare or warning. Marisol woke Elias in the middle of the night, her hand gripping his arm hard enough to leave marks. "It's time," she said, her voice tight with pain and fear and determination. Everything Elias had prepared flew out of his head. The lists, the plans, the chapter he'd memorized, all of it disappeared in the face of Marisol's actual labor, which was messier and louder and more terrifying than any words on a page had suggested. He boiled water because the book said to, laid out clean cloth because that seemed important, and tried to remember how to breathe while Marisol gripped his hand and worked through contractions that made her gasp and curse, and occasionally threatened to kill him if he ever touched her again. "I mean it," she panted between pains. "Never again. This was a terrible idea." "You're doing great," Elias said, feeling useless and panicked and more scared than he'd been during the war. "You're so strong." "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm being torn apart." She was, in a way. But she was also bringing life into the world, and Elias watched in awe and terror as her body did things he couldn't begin to comprehend. Hours passed. He lost count of how many. Time became meaningless, marked only by Marisol's contractions and the slow progression towards something neither of them was ready for. "I can't do this," Marisol said at one point, her face pale and sweating despite the cold. "Elias, I can't. It's too much." "You can." He wiped her face with a damp cloth, trying to keep his voice steady, even though his hands were shaking. "You're already doing it. You're the strongest person I know. You can do this." "I'm scared." "Me too. But we're scared together, remember?" He kissed her forehead. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." The sun was rising when the baby finally came. A girl, tiny and red and screaming with lungs that seemed impossibly large for such a small body. Elias caught her with shaking hands, following the half-remembered instructions from the book, and laid her on Marisol's chest while he dealt with the cord and the afterbirth and all the other messy details that suddenly seemed less important than the fact that his daughter was alive and breathing and here. "She's perfect," Marisol breathed, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the baby. "Look at her. She's absolutely perfect." Elias looked. The baby was wrinkled and covered in vernix, and her face was scrunched up in outrage at being expelled from her warm home into the cold world. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "What should we name her?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Marisol studied their daughter's face with the concentration of someone memorizing something precious. "Elena, after my mother. If that's okay with you." "Elena." Elias tested the name and found it fit. "Elena Crow. Yeah, that's good." They spent the rest of that day and night in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Elias helped Marisol clean up, changed Elena's first diaper with fumbling hands while Marisol coached him through it, and brought food and water while Marisol learned to nurse. It was awkward and difficult, nothing worked the way they'd imagined it would. But Elena was healthy, and Marisol was alive, and they'd survived the thing Elias had been most afraid of. The first week was brutal. Elena cried at all hours, her needs mysterious and urgent. Marisol was exhausted and sore and overwhelmed. Elias tried to help but felt useless, capable of bringing water and changing diapers, but unable to provide the primary thing Elena wanted, which was her mother. They barely slept. They argued over small things because they were too tired to handle big things. The cabin felt too small and too cold and too far from any help if something went wrong. But slowly, gradually, they found their rhythm. Elias learned to swaddle Elena tight enough that she'd settle and sleep. Marisol figured out what different cries meant: hungry, tired, uncomfortable, just angry at the world. They traded off nighttime duties so each of them could get a few hours of consecutive sleep. They learned that sometimes Elena just needed to be held and walked, and that was okay. That wasn't failing. "I have no idea what I'm doing," Marisol said one night, rocking Elena while tears streamed down her own face. "I thought I'd know. I thought it would be instinctive, but I'm just guessing all the time." "You're keeping her alive," Elias pointed out. "Fed, warm, clean, loved. That's not guessing, that's parenting." "Is it working?" He looked at Elena, who was watching Marisol's face with the intense focus of someone learning what a mother looked like. "Yeah, I think it is." March brought the first hints of thaw, and Dutch's wagon struggling up the mountain road earlier than usual. He took one look at Elena, now a month old and starting to look less like an angry potato and more like a person, and laughed. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head. "You two don't do anything the easy way, do you?" "Never have," Marisol said, shifting Elena to her other hip. The baby was studying Dutch with suspicious eyes, not crying, but clearly considering it. "Probably never will." Dutch brought supplies and news, and a letter from Marisol's cousin, who'd been overjoyed to hear about the marriage and was now going to be thrilled about the baby. He also brought something else, a letter from the matchmaking service addressed to Elias. "Thought you closed my file," Elias said, taking the envelope with a frown. "Did. This is different." Dutch gestured at the letter. "Read it." Elias opened the envelope and scanned the contents. The matchmaking service was writing to inform him that his case, the man who'd gone through 7 brides before finding success with the 8th, had become somewhat famous. Other men were writing in, asking for advice. Other women were asking if there were more mountain men willing to wait for the right match instead of giving up. They wanted to know his secret. What had made this time different? Elias read the letter twice, then handed it to Marisol, who read it while Elena gummed her knuckles and drooled. "What are you going to tell them?" Marisol asked. "The truth." Elias looked at Dutch, then at Marisol, then at Elena, who was the physical embodiment of everything he'd never thought he'd have. That there's no secret. That it worked this time because we were both broken enough to be honest about it. Because we chose partnership over romance, survival over comfort. Because Marisol was stubborn enough to stay through the hard parts, and I finally learned how to let someone help me. "That's not very romantic," Dutch observed. "No," Marisol agreed, "but it's real. And real matters more than romantic." Elias took Elena from Marisol's arms, and the baby settled against his chest with the trust of someone who knew she was safe. "Tell them that love isn't what saves you. It's what you build when you stop trying to save yourself and start working to save each other. Tell them that marriage isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone willing to be imperfect with you." Dutch nodded slowly. "I'll pass that along. Don't know if it'll help anyone, but it's better advice than most people get." After Dutch left, Elias and Marisol stood on the porch, watching the wagon disappear down the mountain. Elena was asleep between them in Marisol's arms, her tiny face peaceful in the way only babies could achieve. The mountain stretched out around them, still dangerous, still demanding, still ready to test them at every turn. But it was their mountain now, their home, the place where they'd both stopped running and started building. "You think we'll stay here forever?" Marisol asked quietly. "Raise Elena in this isolation? Maybe have more children?" "I don't know about forever." Elias put his arm around her shoulders, careful not to jostle the baby. "But I know I want to stay as long as it feels right, as long as we're choosing it instead of just surviving it. And when it stops feeling right, then we'll figure something else out. together. He looked down at Elena, at this impossibly small person who'd changed everything without meaning to. That's the real secret, I think. Not about making it work up here specifically, but about making anything work. You keep choosing each other, keep being honest about the hard parts, keep showing up even when it would be easier to quit, and eventually, all those choices add up to something that looks like love. Marisol leaned into him, and they stood like that as the sun climbed higher, and the snow continued its slow melt, and their daughter slept on, unaware that she'd been born into the hardest possible circumstances and the most determined love. The months that followed were a blur of exhaustion and small miracles. Elena grew, her personality emerging in fits and starts. Stubborn, like both her parents, curious about everything, laughing at the wind and crying at the ravens that circled overhead. Marisol healed and regained her strength and proved herself just as capable with a baby on her hip as she'd been without. Elias learned that he could be gentle, that being a father didn't require perfection but presence, that love was as much about changing diapers at 3 a.m. as it was about grand gestures. They added a second room to the cabin that summer, working around Elena's naps and needs. It took twice as long as it should have, but when it was done, they had space that felt less like survival and more like living. Space for Elena to grow. Space for the future they were building one day at a time. Other changes came slowly. Marisol taught Elena songs in Spanish, the same ones her mother had taught her. Elias carved toys from pine scraps and made up stories about the mountains that Elena was too young to understand but seemed to enjoy anyway. They took turns keeping her entertained while the other worked, learning the intricate dance of parenting while maintaining everything else that kept them alive. Some days were harder than others. Days when Elena wouldn't stop crying, and Marisol was at the end of her patience, and Elias wanted to escape into the woods and not come back. Days when money was tight and supplies were low, and they both wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake trying to raise a child in conditions this extreme. Days when they fought about small things because they were too exhausted to communicate well about big things. But those days were balanced by better ones. Days when Elena laughed at something ridiculous, and they both laughed too. Days when the weather was perfect and they could work outside together, Elena on a blanket nearby, watching the world with wide eyes. Days when they'd collapse into bed at night, and Marisol would say something like, "We survived another day," and Elias would respond, "Barely." And they'd both smile because surviving barely was still surviving. The second winter with Elena was easier than the first. Not because winter was kinder, but because they knew what to expect. They knew how to keep a baby warm in extreme cold, how to manage cabin fever when you couldn't go outside for days, how to trade off childcare so each person got a break before they broke completely. Elena's first birthday came in February, with no fanfare except a small cake Marisol made from precious sugar and eggs. Elena smashed her face into it with the dedication of someone discovering joy for the first time, and Elias captured the moment in his mind like a photograph. His daughter, his wife, his family, all of them together in a cabin that had once been a prison and was now a home. "She's going to grow up wild," Marisol observed, wiping frosting off Elena's face while the baby protested and squirmed. No other children to play with, no school, just us and the mountains. "Is that bad?" "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not." Marisol settled Elena on her lap, and the baby immediately grabbed for her mother's hair. But it's what we can give her. Love, safety, honesty, and the knowledge that she comes from people who chose the hard path because it was theirs. "That's more than a lot of children get," Elias said. "I hope it's enough." It would have to be. They couldn't give Elena an easy life or a conventional one. They couldn't protect her from every hardship or guarantee she'd thank them for this choice when she was older. But they could give her parents who loved each other and loved her, who worked every day to create something worth having, who showed up even when showing up was the hardest thing to do. That was the best inheritance anyone could leave. Not money or property or status, but the example of what it meant to keep choosing, keep trying, keep building, even when everything said to give up. Years passed. Dutch made his twice-yearly trips up the mountain and reported that the world below was changing in ways that didn't touch them. Railroads were spreading, towns were growing, the wild places were getting smaller. But on their mountain, time moved differently. Seasons cycled. Elena grew from baby to toddler to a small girl who could walk the trap lines with Elias and help her mother in the garden. "Mama, why do we live here?" Elena asked one day when she was 5. "Tommy at the trading post says we're crazy, says nobody lives on mountains unless they're hiding or broken." Marisol glanced at Elias across the cabin. He could see her deciding how much truth to give their daughter. "We're not hiding," Marisol said finally, "and we were broken when we came here, both of us. But we're not anymore. Or if we are, we're broken in ways that fit together." "I don't understand." "You will someday." Marisol pulled Elena onto her lap. "The simple answer is this. We live here because we chose to. Because your father needed a place to heal, and I needed a place to build something new, and we found each other in the process. This mountain gave us that. It gave us each other. It gave us you." "But wouldn't it be easier somewhere else?" "Much easier," Elias said, joining them. "But easy isn't always better. This life is hard, but it's honest. It's ours. And everyone who lives here chose it, knowing exactly what it cost. That matters." Elena thought about that with the serious concentration of a child trying to understand adult concepts. "When I grow up, can I choose to leave?" The question hit Elias harder than he'd expected. But it was fair. They'd chosen this life for themselves, but Elena hadn't been given a choice. She'd been born into their decision and would have to live with the consequences. "Yes," he said, and meant it. "When you're old enough, you can choose to leave, or to stay, or to do something completely different that we haven't thought of. That's what choice means. Picking your own path, not just following the one your parents walked." "Okay." Elena seemed satisfied with that. She wiggled off Marisol's lap and went back to playing with the wooden animals Elias had carved for her, the crisis averted as quickly as it had appeared. But that night, lying in bed after Elena was asleep, Marisol said, "She's going to leave someday. You know that, right?" "I know." "Are you okay with it?" Elias thought about it honestly. "I don't know if I'll be okay with it when it happens, but I understand why it needs to be her choice. We gave her this life because it was the best we could offer, but we can't force her to want it. All we can do is raise her strong enough and confident enough to choose for herself when the time comes." "When did you get so wise?" "I married you. Some of it had to rub off eventually." She laughed and hit him with a pillow, and they fell asleep the way they had for years now, tangled together, comfortable in a way that took time and work and honesty to build. More years. Elena grew taller, smarter, more independent. She learned to read from the books Dutch brought up the mountain. She learned to shoot from Marisol and to track from Elias. She learned that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant finding reasons to want to. When Elena was 10, Marisol got pregnant again. It was unexpected. They'd thought they were done after one child, that they'd gotten lucky once and shouldn't push it. But nature had other plans, and 9 months later, a boy joined their family. They named him Thomas after Marisol's father, and the cabin that had once held one lonely man now overflowed with the noise and chaos of a family. The second child was easier in some ways, harder in others. They knew what they were doing now, but they were also older and more tired. Elena helped, proving herself surprisingly good with her baby brother, and between the three of them, they managed. "This is it," Marisol said firmly after Thomas was born. 2 children on a mountain is already insane. 3 would be criminal." Elias, who'd been thinking the same thing, agreed readily. Life continued. The children grew. The cabin expanded again. The mountain tested them with storms and cold and isolation, but they'd learned its rhythms well enough that the tests felt less like attacks and more like expected challenges. Elena turned 16 the same year a young man showed up with Dutch's wagon, hired to help with the increasingly difficult mountain route. The boy, Jacob his name was, took one look at Elena and forgot how to speak properly. Elena, for her part, pretended not to notice while very clearly noticing. "That's trouble," Marisol observed, watching the interaction from the cabin porch. "Yep," Elias agreed. "She's going to want to leave with him eventually, follow him down the mountain, see what else is out there." "Probably." "Are you okay with that?" Elias watched his daughter, no longer a child, nearly a woman, and felt the same complicated mix of pride and grief that all parents must feel when their children start choosing their own paths. "I'm going to have to be. We raised her to be strong enough to choose. Can't complain when she actually does it." But when it happened, 2 years later, it hurt more than he'd prepared for. Elena came to them one spring morning and said, "I'm going down the mountain. Jacob asked me to come with him, and I want to see what else is out there. I want to know if this is the life I'd choose or if I'm just living your choice." "And if you choose differently?" Marisol asked, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Then I'll have chosen honestly, the way you taught me." Elena looked between her parents. "But I need to know. Need to see other places, other ways of living. Need to understand what I'm choosing when I eventually choose." They let her go. It was one of the hardest things Elias ever did, watching his daughter walk down the mountain with Dutch's wagon, not knowing if she'd ever come back. But he'd meant what he said years ago. Choice only mattered if you were free to make it. Thomas, who was 8, didn't understand why his sister was leaving. "Did we do something wrong?" "No," Elias said, pulling his son close. "We did something right. We raised her strong enough to want more than what we could give her. That's not failure. That's success." "Then why does it feel bad?" "Because love is complicated. It means wanting what's best for someone, even when what's best for them hurts you. Your sister needs to find her own path. We have to let her." 3 months later, a letter came. Elena was in Denver, working in a shop, living with Jacob's family. She was overwhelmed by the crowds and the noise, but also excited. She missed them. She missed the mountain, but she needed more time to figure out who she was when she wasn't just their daughter. More letters came over the following year. Elena was learning to read and write better, was taking classes, was discovering things about herself and the world. She and Jacob were courting properly now, with his family's blessing. She thought she might want to marry him. "But I want to bring him here first," she wrote. "Want him to see where I come from, understand what shaped me. Want to make sure he can handle the reality of my family before we make any promises." They came that summer. Jacob was a nervous, earnest young man who clearly loved Elena and was terrified of her parents. Elias liked him immediately, and so did Marisol, though neither of them made it easy on the boy. They put him to work, testing him, seeing if he had the grit to understand what it meant to be part of a family that had chosen the hardest possible path. He passed. Barely, but he passed. "So?" Elias asked Elena on her last night before returning to Denver. "Did you figure it out? Who you are without us?" "I'm still figuring it out," Elena admitted. "But I learned something important. I learned that I don't want to live on the mountain permanently. I need people, community, connection to a bigger world. But I also learned that everything you taught me, about honesty and choosing hard things and showing up even when it's difficult, those things matter everywhere. You gave me the foundation to choose my own path. That's more valuable than any specific location." "We're proud of you," Marisol said, hugging their daughter tight. "Whatever you choose, wherever you go, we're proud." Elena left again, but this time it didn't hurt as much. Because she'd come back once, which meant she might come back again. And even if she didn't, they'd given her what mattered, roots deep enough to give her strength, wings strong enough to let her fly. Years passed. Thomas grew into a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved the mountain in ways Elena never had. He had no interest in leaving, told them regularly that this was where he belonged. They believed him, but made sure he knew he had choices too. Elena got married, had children of her own, brought them to visit the mountain once a year, and Elias and Marisol marveled at the tiny humans who carried pieces of them into a future they'd never see. Marisol's hair turned gray, then white. Elias's back bent from years of hard labor. They moved slower, worked less, relied on Thomas more and more to handle the heavy tasks. But they were together, and that was what mattered. One winter evening, when Elias was 60 and Marisol was 58, they sat by the fire in the cabin that had witnessed their entire adult lives. Thomas was out checking traps. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of burning wood. "Did you ever regret it?" Elias asked. "Staying here? Choosing this?" Marisol thought about it honestly, the way she always did. "There were moments, hard moments, when I wondered what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices. But regret? No. This life was exactly what I needed it to be. Hard and honest and real, and it gave me you. Gave me our children, gave me a purpose that was mine, not inherited or assigned, but chosen." She took his hand. "Did you regret it?" "Never." And it was true. The 7 brides before Marisol had been wrong, not because there was anything wrong with them, but because they'd been looking for something he couldn't give. But Marisol had come looking for exactly what he had to offer, and in the strange alchemy of compatible damage, they'd built something that lasted. Not perfect, never perfect, but real in a way that mattered more than perfection ever could. "I love you," he said, the words easier now after decades of practice. "I love you too, even though you're still impossible and stubborn. And you're still bossy and opinionated. Perfect match then." They laughed, and the sound filled the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Outside, snow fell on the mountain that had witnessed their transformation from broken individuals into something stronger. The wind howled, testing the cabin's defenses the way it had for decades. And inside, two people who'd survived impossible odds sat together in the life they'd built, choosing each other one more time. Because that was the real secret, the one Elias had tried to explain to the matchmaking service all those years ago. Love wasn't what saved you. Love was what you built, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day, when you stopped trying to be saved and started working to save each other. And sometimes, if you were lucky and stubborn and honest enough to keep showing up even when it would be easier to quit, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.